Hello and welcome to a slow, quiet hour spent inside the mind. Tonight we're going somewhere a little deeper than usual. 100 small truths about how we think, how we feel, and how we carry ourselves through the world, gathered slowly, one at a time, so you have nothing to do but listen. Some of these will feel like something you've lived yourself, without ever having the words for it. Others may surprise you entirely, but all of them are here simply so you can rest inside them, the way you'd rest inside a story. Someone you trust is telling you quietly in a dark room, with nowhere else you need to be. So let your breath slow down now. Let your hands go heavy wherever they're resting. There is nothing to solve tonight, nothing to prepare for. Let's begin. Picture this. It's 3:14 in the morning. And you're awake for no reason at all. The room is dark, your chest feels a little tight, and your mind has already started running through tomorrow before tomorrow has even arrived. If that feels familiar, you're not broken and you're not alone in it either. You're simply human, living inside a mind that never fully stops working, even at hours like this one. And here's something strange about that mind. Your brain edits your memories every single time you remember them. Each time a memory is recalled, it isn't replayed like a film reel pulled from a shelf. It's quietly rebuilt piece by piece, using whatever details happen to be available in that exact moment, including how you feel right now, lying awake in the dark, turning something over. This is why an old memory, a childhood afternoon, an old apartment, an old version of someone you once loved, can shift slightly over the years without you ever noticing the change happening in real time. Psychologists call this reconsolidation, the brief, fragile window where a memory turns soft and editable before it's filed away again, a little different than it was before. It isn't a flaw in you, it's simply how a living memory behaves, not a photograph sealed behind glass, untouchable and fixed, but wet clay, reshaped gently, every single time your fingers happen to touch it. Think for a moment of an old argument with someone you love, one you've replayed so many times over the years that you're no longer entirely sure which parts actually happened, and which parts your mind quietly softened or sharpened somewhere along the way. That uncertainty isn't a failure of memory. It's simply proof that the memory has been alive this whole time, breathing, shifting, being touched again and again by the person you've since become. And so even the 3 a.m. thoughts keeping you company tonight are not fixed truths, carved permanently in stone. They are only tonight's version of the story, and tomorrow's version, quietly, may already be a little softer than this one. Think of the last time you sat in a parked car outside your own house, engine off, keys still in your hand, not quite ready to go inside just yet, just sitting there in the quiet, listening to nothing at all. That stillness can feel strange, even faintly uncomfortable, because silence can feel louder than sound to a tired, anxious mind. When the nervous system is on alert, even quietly, even without an obvious reason, it searches constantly for information to explain what's happening around it. And an empty, quiet space can feel unsettling, simply because there's nothing there to fill in the blanks it's used to filling. Psychologists describe this as a kind of hypervigilance. The mind is scanning for threat even when no threat actually exists anywhere nearby. It's the same reason a still house at night can feel heavier than a noisy one, and why some people leave a television murmuring softly in the background just to have something, anything, to explain the silence around them. Perhaps you've noticed this yourself, on a night much like tonight, reaching for some small sound, a fan, a clock, a distant car passing outside. Not because you needed it, but because the silence itself felt like it was asking a question you didn't have an answer for yet. The quiet itself isn't dangerous. It's only unfamiliar to a mind that's spent so long filling gaps with meaning, any meaning, just to feel oriented. If you've ever wondered why rest doesn't come easily even when nothing at all is wrong, This may be part of the answer you've been looking for. And in learning to sit inside that silence without flinching, without needing it to mean something threatening, the nervous system slowly, patiently remembers how to let go and how to simply rest. If you've ever felt a real physical ache in your chest after someone you loved walked away for good, you already know something science has only recently managed to confirm. The brain treats emotional pain and physical pain in strikingly similar ways, more similar than most people would ever guess. Brain imaging shows that rejection, heartbreak, and social exclusion activate some of the very same regions that light up during an actual physical injury, a burn, a break, a fall. Which is part of why heartbreak doesn't just feel sad in some abstract way. It feels like it hurts, somewhere real, somewhere just beneath the ribs, exactly where you'd expect an ache to live. Some studies have even found that ordinary pain relief can slightly dull the intensity of emotional distress. A strange, almost unsettling overlap between two kinds of hurt we usually think of as entirely separate categories. Think of the particular exhaustion that follows a hard goodbye, the kind that settles into your shoulders and your eyes the same way a long illness might, even though nothing about your body was ever actually injured. That heaviness is real, measurable, and it deserves the same gentleness you'd offer any other kind of healing. If tonight you're carrying an old ache like that, something from years ago that still surfaces sometimes, know that your body isn't exaggerating, and it isn't being dramatic. It's simply responding the way it was quietly built to respond all along. The mind doesn't always separate a broken bone from a broken heart quite as cleanly as we assume it should. Perhaps because to the nervous system, both are simply forms of harm, asking in their own quiet way to be tended to gently. If this one landed somewhere close to home, you're welcome to sit with it a moment before we move on together. There's no rush at all tonight. Imagine standing at a kitchen counter in the middle of a task you've done 100 times before, folding laundry, washing a single dish, wiping down a surface that's already clean, and suddenly a thought arrives out of nowhere, clear and unexpected. Almost like a small gift you didn't ask for. That isn't an accident, and it isn't random either. Boredom is actually one of the most productive states the brain can enter, even though it rarely feels that way while it's happening. When outside stimulation drops away completely, the brain doesn't switch off or go quiet. It shifts instead into what's known as the default mode network, a soft, unhurried system responsible for daydreaming, self-reflection, and unexpected creative connections between ideas that seemed unrelated only moments before. Some of the clearest insights people ever have in their entire lives arrive during dull, unstimulating moments exactly like the one at that counter, or waiting in a slow-moving line at the store, or driving a familiar road with nothing left to focus on but the pavement ahead. Think of a long, quiet drive you've taken before, one where the scenery barely changed for an hour, and how somewhere around the 40-minute mark, without meaning to, you found yourself understanding something about your own life that you hadn't quite put into words before that drive began. Modern life often treats boredom as something to be eliminated instantly. A phone reached for the second any gap in attention opens up, any silence at all. But underneath that small discomfort, a mind is quietly working the entire time, wandering its own corridors, waiting patiently to be left alone long enough to actually think. The next time boredom arrives uninvited, unannounced, you might let it stay a little longer than usual, just to see what quietly rises to the surface when you do. Think of a stranger who once held a door for you on a particularly hard day, said nothing more than a simple, "Here you go." And somehow, inexplicably, it stayed with you far longer than a moment like that should have. The brain forms a physical response to kindness before it ever registers any logical reason for that response. A small act of unexpected warmth, a held door, a kind word from someone tired themselves, can lower stress hormones and trigger a release of oxytocin, often before we've even consciously processed what actually happened to us. This is why comfort can arrive in the body before it ever arrives in the mind. A softening in the shoulders, a slower breath, a slight loosening in the chest, all before a single thought has managed to explain why any of it is happening. Perhaps you can remember a moment exactly like that. Not the biggest kindness you've ever received, but one of the smallest. A bus driver who waited an extra second, a cashier who smiled like they meant it, and how strange it was that something so small could sit with you for years afterward, quietly, without you ever asking it to stay. Kindness doesn't always need to be understood in order to be felt. Sometimes the nervous system simply recognizes safety, quietly and instinctively, and lets go of something it had been carefully holding on to. If there's someone tonight who once did something small like that for you, years ago perhaps, or recently, you might let yourself remember them for a moment now. Gently, before we continue on to the next thought, picture two people leaving the exact same difficult conversation, walking to two separate cars in the same parking lot, and somehow arriving at two completely different versions of what was actually said between them. This happens far more often than you'd think, because people tend to remember the emotional tone of an event much more clearly than they remember its exact details. This is why two people can disagree entirely on the specific words spoken during an old argument, and yet agree completely without hesitation on exactly how it felt to be in that room together. Emotional memory is processed by different, far more persistent pathways than plain factual memory, which is part of why feelings tend to outlast facts, sometimes by years, sometimes by entire decades. Think of the last time someone asked you to recall the exact words from an old, painful conversation, and how the words themselves seem to have dissolved somewhere along the way, while the feeling of that room, the tightness in your throat, the particular quality of the silence afterward, remained as vivid as if it had only just happened. A conversation from 10 years ago might be almost entirely gone in its precise details, but the ache or the warmth remains fully intact, as clear and immediate as if it had happened only last week, waiting quietly just beneath the surface. As if the heart, in its own way, kept a private transcript, long after the mind had stopped taking notes on the specifics. Say the words out loud right now, quietly, to no one but yourself if you're comfortable doing so. I feel tired. Notice, just for a moment, what happens in your chest when you actually say it. The brain can experience real, measurable relief simply from naming an emotion out loud, rather than letting it circle silently. This process, sometimes called affect labeling by psychologists, has been shown to calm activity in the amygdala, the brain's alarm system, almost the instant a feeling is finally put into words. Saying quietly, "I feel anxious," or "I feel overwhelmed," doesn't solve the underlying problem itself. Not really. But it appears to soften its grip almost immediately, the way loosening a hand that's been clenched too long finally lets the blood return. Think of a difficult week you've had recently, one where you carried something quietly for days without naming it to anyone, not even yourself, and how different it might have felt on just the first evening if you'd simply said the true sentence out loud instead of holding it silently behind your teeth. It's a small, private kind of magic. That language itself, so plain and so unglamorous most days, can reach directly into the nervous system and loosen something that felt entirely unmovable only a moment before you spoke. If you're carrying something heavy tonight, something you haven't quite said out loud to anyone, you might try naming it just once quietly before you let it rest for now. Think of the particular smell of rain hitting warm pavement on a summer evening and how it can pull you instantly, fully, into an entire memory from 15 years ago before you've even had time to think about why it's happening. Scent, it turns out, can hold a memory far more precisely than a photograph ever could manage to. Unlike sight or sound, smell travels almost directly to the brain's emotional and memory centers, largely bypassing much of the usual conscious processing altogether. This is why a particular scent, rain on pavement, a certain soap, a meal cooking somewhere nearby in someone else's kitchen, can pull an entire moment back into vivid focus all at once. The feeling, the weather, even the exact quality of light that evening carried with it. Think, too, of walking past a stranger wearing the same cologne or perfume someone from your past once wore, and how for just a second or two, your whole body reacted before your mind had even caught up to explain why. An old room, an old porch, an old version of a voice all arriving at once, uninvited but familiar. A photograph can only show you what a place looked like from the outside. A scent for just a moment can make you feel as though you're standing inside it again, completely, unguarded, exactly as you were back then. Nothing held back. And while we're speaking of what happens quietly while you rest, sleep doesn't only rest the body while you're unaware, it reorganizes the mind's entire filing system behind the scenes. During certain stages of sleep, the brain sorts carefully through the day's experiences, strengthening whatever matters most and quietly discarding whatever doesn't serve you anymore. This is part of why a problem that felt completely unsolvable at midnight can feel strangely, almost suspiciously clearer once morning finally arrives, as if some invisible hand had tidied the room while you were away from it entirely. Think of a decision you once agonized over late at night, certain you'd never find your way through it, and how, almost embarrassingly, the answer simply arrived on its own the next morning while you were pouring coffee, fully formed, as though it had been waiting patiently for you to wake up and notice it. The sleeping brain isn't idle in the slightest. It's sorting, connecting, pruning, working quietly in the dark long after the lights have gone out and the whole house has settled into stillness. Somewhere in that quiet reorganization tonight, your own mind will be doing exactly what it does best, turning today's small chaos into tomorrow's slightly clearer order, without you lifting a finger. If any of these facts have felt like a small kind of company to you tonight, you're welcome to stay a while longer. There's nothing you have to do except keep listening quietly. Think back to the last time you walked away from an ordinary conversation, replaying it over and over in your head, certain you'd said the wrong thing somewhere, certain the other person had noticed and quietly judged you for it. People consistently underestimate how much others actually like them after a conversation ends. This is known among psychologists as the liking gap, a quiet, persistent mismatch between how warmly someone is genuinely perceived and how anxiously they replay the interaction afterward in their own head. Most people walk away from an exchange assuming they said something slightly wrong, a little awkward, too much, too little, never quite right, while the other person in that very same moment is often walking away thinking exactly the opposite thing entirely, quietly glad the conversation happened at all, maybe even hoping to talk again soon. Picture the last new friendship you made, the early days of it, how many nights you may have spent quietly worried you'd been too quiet or too much, only to find, weeks later, that they'd been carrying the exact same private worry about themselves the whole time. It's a strange, remarkably universal blind spot, one that quietly convinces so many kind, thoughtful people that they're somehow harder to love than they actually are, when the truth is usually the very opposite. If that sounds like you, tonight might be a good night to simply let that particular thought rest, unexamined just this once, and trust that the warmth was real. Imagine standing in a crowded room somewhere, and someone repeats a claim you've heard once or twice before in passing, and without quite meaning to, you find yourself nodding along with it, even though you never actually checked whether it was true or not. The mind often mistakes plain familiarity for actual truth, more often than most people would ever expect. Information that has simply been repeated, regardless of its real accuracy, begins to feel more believable purely because it's been heard before somewhere, sometime. This shortcut likely evolved to help the brain move quickly through a world overflowing with information it couldn't possibly verify all at once. But it means that repeated claims, even entirely false ones, can start to feel oddly convincing over time, simply through the quiet mechanism of repetition alone. Think of an old family story you've heard told so many times at gatherings that it now feels like your own memory, even though, if you're honest, you were far too young to have actually remembered any of it firsthand. And yet it feels every bit as real as something you lived through yourself. It's a gentle reminder that comfort and truth are not always the very same thing, no matter how similar they can feel in the moment, and that the mind, in its constant search for ease, sometimes settles for what feels familiar rather than what is actually verifiably real. Think of the last time your heart pounded right before something exciting was about to happen. A first date, a long-awaited trip, a reunion you'd been looking forward to for months. And compare that honestly to how your heart pounds right before something you've been quietly dreading instead. A racing heart before a difficult moment and a racing heart before something joyful can feel almost completely identical to the body experiencing it. Physiologically, anxiety and anticipation share nearly the exact same signature: elevated heart rate, quickened breath, a subtle restlessness in the chest that refuses to sit still no matter what you do. The difference is often only in the story the mind chooses to attach to that same physical sensation, nothing more. Think of a moment before walking into an interview, or before stepping onto a stage, or before opening a door you weren't sure what waited behind and how. With only a small shift in the words you used to describe it to yourself, that same trembling feeling could have just as easily belonged to joy instead of fear. This means some nervousness can actually be gently reframed simply by naming it as excitement instead of fear out loud or silently to yourself. The body doesn't always know the difference between the two until the mind quietly decides which word it wants to use for it this time. Picture an athlete standing at the starting line somewhere, eyes closed, completely still, running through the entire race in their mind before their body has moved even a single inch forward. The brain rehearses movement even when the body itself stays completely, perfectly still throughout. Simply imagining an action, lifting an arm, walking down a familiar street you know by heart, activates many of the very same neural pathways used when actually performing that action in real life. This is part of why athletes so often mentally rehearse a routine before performing it live, and why visualizing a calm outcome beforehand can genuinely ease the body ahead of something stressful. An interview, a hard conversation, a flight you've been quietly dreading for weeks. Think of the night before, something you were nervous about, and how simply picturing yourself walking through it calmly, step by step, in your mind before falling asleep, may have left you steadier the next morning than you expected to feel, as though some part of you had already lived through it once before arriving. The mind, in its own quiet way, doesn't always distinguish sharply between doing something and simply imagining doing it. It rehearses both faithfully in the dark, long before the actual moment ever arrives to test it. Think of a friend who once told you, quietly, almost embarrassed by it, about a fear they'd never said out loud to another living soul before that moment, and how much closer you felt to them immediately afterward. People often feel closest to others, not during the happiest moments shared together, but during the vulnerable ones instead. Sharing a fear, a doubt, or a quiet insecurity tends to deepen connection far more reliably than sharing only good news ever seems to manage. Psychologists call this the vulnerability effect, the strange, remarkably consistent truth that admitting something soft about ourselves often makes others feel safer, admitting the very same thing in return, almost immediately. Think of the friendships in your own life that shifted, quietly and permanently. The moment one of you finally said the true thing instead of the polite one. And how that single honest sentence did more for the friendship than months of easier conversation ever had. Somewhere in that mutual honesty, the distance between two people quietly closes, and for a moment, neither one is performing for the other anymore. They're simply being, fully and without pretense, in the very same room together. If you felt that kind of closeness recently, you might carry it with you gently into sleep tonight. Think of the particular chill of a winter evening, the kind that makes you pull a blanket a little tighter, and how, in that exact moment, a memory of something warm from years ago can arrive uninvited and somehow leave you feeling less cold than you were a second before. Nostalgia isn't only a feeling in the heart, it can genuinely make the body feel physically warmer. Experiments have found that recalling a cherished memory can raise perceived temperature and even reduce the sensation of physical cold in a room that hasn't changed at all. Psychologists believe this link exists because social warmth and physical warmth are processed by overlapping systems in the brain, both tied closely to feelings of safety. This is part of why nostalgic thoughts tend to rise more often in the colder months, almost as if the mind is quietly compensating for what the season has taken away. Think of an old photograph you keep somewhere, not because you look at it often, but because knowing it exists is its own kind of comfort, a small ember kept lit in a drawer. Whether triggered by a song, a smell, or simply the particular blue of an evening sky, nostalgia can wrap the body in a gentle kind of warmth that has nothing to do with the thermostat at all. Think of the last time you were sitting near someone and without either of you saying a word, you both yawned within seconds of each other, and how strange it felt. Almost like your bodies had agreed on something your minds never discussed. Yawning is contagious, and not only among people, dogs, chimpanzees, and even some birds have been observed catching yawns from others nearby. Psychologists believe this is linked closely to empathy and social bonding, an unconscious mirroring of the people around us that quietly reinforces connection. In humans, you're more likely to catch a yawn from someone you're close to than from a stranger passing by, which suggests the contagion follows the shape of intimacy itself. Think of a long car ride with someone you love. Both of you tired, both of you yawning in that same slow rhythm, without either of you needing to explain it to the other. In a strange, wordless way, a shared yawn is a small reminder of the invisible thread connecting us to the people nearby. A quiet signal that says, without language, we're moving through this tiredness together. Think back to a lecture, a meeting, or even a long conversation, and notice how clearly you remember how it began and how it ended, while the middle stretch has mostly dissolved into a kind of soft blur. This is called the primacy and recency effect, our tendency to recall the first and last items in a sequence far more vividly than anything in between. The opening moments benefit from more attention and rehearsal, while the closing moments stay fresh simply because they're the most recent thing the mind has to hold on to. This pattern shows up everywhere. We remember the start and the end of a vacation more clearly than the middle days, the opening and closing lines of a difficult conversation more than what was said in between. Think of the last goodbye you said to someone at an airport. How the exact words might already be fading, but the way the moment opened and closed, the first look, the last wave, remains sharp and untouched. In a way, the mind frames our lives like stories, with the opening and closing scenes always shining the brightest in memory. Picture looking directly at a shelf, glancing away for only a second to answer a question, and then looking back to find something on that shelf has changed, moved, or vanished entirely, without you ever noticing it happen. This is called change blindness, a striking quirk where the brain can fail to register even large alterations in a scene if they occur during a brief interruption in attention. This happens because attention is selective by nature. The mind simply can't process every detail at once, so it quietly fills gaps with assumptions, built from prior knowledge instead of fresh observation. In daily life, this is often why we miss small rearrangements in a familiar room, or fail to notice that a friend changed their hair until someone else points it out first. Think of walking through your own home in the dark, trusting your memory of where everything sits, rather than what your eyes can actually confirm in that moment. It's a quiet reminder that perception isn't a perfect camera capturing every frame. It's a patchwork of focused detail and inferred continuity, stitched together so smoothly that we rarely notice the seams unless someone shows us exactly where to look. Try this gently, right now if you'd like. Let the corners of your mouth lift, just slightly, even without any real reason to smile. Notice what happens, faintly, in your chest. Even when there's no genuine joy behind it, the simple act of smiling can subtly shift your mood, a phenomenon psychologists call the facial feedback hypothesis. When you smile, the muscles in your face send signals back to the brain, triggering a small release of mood-lifting chemicals like dopamine and serotonin, even if nothing else around you has changed. The effect works in the opposite direction too. Frowning or tensing the jaw can quietly reinforce feelings of tension that were already there. It's not a cure for anything heavier, but in a stressful moment, a small, private smile can act as a gentle nudge toward calm. Think of the last time you smiled at your own reflection for no reason at all, half embarrassed, and noticed a flicker of lightness anyway. It's proof that the mind and body are in constant conversation, and sometimes the body is the one that speaks first. Think of the last time you felt an instant, wordless pull towards someone, a laugh that reminded you of somebody kind, a voice that felt familiar before you'd even learned their name. Attraction feels like a fully conscious choice, but many of its foundations are quietly laid beneath awareness. Subtle cues, the symmetry of a face, the particular tone of a voice, even scent, can trigger responses rooted deep in both biology and personal history. Evolutionary psychologists suggest some preferences trace back to health and safety signals, while others are shaped entirely by culture and memory. The subconscious also weaves in old associations without asking permission. A laugh that echoes someone kind from years ago, a certain calmness that reminds you, faintly, of home. These impressions often form before conscious thought has even begun its analysis, creating that feeling of instant, inexplicable chemistry. Think of meeting someone new and feeling strangely at ease within minutes, long before you could explain why. It's a quiet dance between ancient instinct and the unique pathways carved by your own life, guiding your eyes and your heart before you've even realized a direction was chosen. Think of a task you've loved for years, cooking, painting, running, playing an instrument, and how there have been moments doing it where hours disappeared without you noticing a single one of them passing. A flow state is a mental space where focus becomes effortless, time feels elastic, and the outside world quietly fades into the background. Psychologists say flow occurs when the challenge of a task closely matches your skill level. Difficult enough to stay engaging, but not so difficult it becomes overwhelming. In this state, activity in the brain's self-conscious regions actually decreases, freeing attention to merge fully with the task itself. Flow isn't only about productivity, it's a deeply satisfying kind of immersion, where action and awareness become one continuous thing. Think of the last time you looked up from something you loved doing, and were genuinely surprised by how much time had passed, disoriented in the gentlest possible way. In that quiet trance, minutes dissolve into moments, and the mind moves as smoothly as a river finding its way, unhurried, toward the sea. Imagine walking down a quiet street alone at night and noticing someone who seems to need help, and compare that honestly to noticing the exact same thing while surrounded by a crowd of strangers. In emergencies, the presence of other people can actually reduce the likelihood that anyone steps in at all, a phenomenon known as the bystander effect. When alone, people feel a much greater personal sense of responsibility to act, But in a crowd, that responsibility quietly diffuses, each person assuming someone else will surely step forward instead. This pattern has been observed again and again, from staged accidents to something as small as a dropped bag on a busy sidewalk. The more people present, the lower the actual chance that any single person intervenes. Simply knowing about this tendency, though, tends to counteract it. People aware of the bystander effect are measurably more likely to act regardless of the crowd around them. It's a quiet reminder that in moments where help is genuinely needed, the person who steps forward must sometimes simply choose to be you. Think of walking into a room where someone is visibly tense, jaw tight, arms crossed, and noticing your own shoulders rising slightly before either of you has said a single word to the other. Stress can spread between people entirely without language. Simply observing someone's tense body language or a shift in the tone of their voice can trigger a mirrored stress response in the person watching. A quiet transmission rooted in empathy and the way our nervous systems tune themselves to the people nearby. While this can help groups respond collectively to real danger, it also means one person's anxiety can ripple outward and quietly affect the mood of an entire room. The comforting reverse is also true. Calm can spread in exactly the same way, softening tension without a single word exchanged. Think of the specific kind of steadiness that settles into a room when one calm person simply sits down among a group of anxious ones. In this sense, managing your own state isn't only self-care, it's a small, quiet gift you're offering to everyone nearby. Think of a conversation with someone you clicked with instantly, and how, without either of you noticing, you may have started sitting the same way, gesturing similarly, even breathing at a matching pace by the end of it. Subtly matching another person's gestures, posture, or speech can create a real sense of connection and trust almost instantly. This unconscious tendency, sometimes called the chameleon effect, is part of our deep social wiring. And when it happens naturally, it signals empathy and attentiveness without either person needing to say so. It's part of why conversations sometimes fall into a shared rhythm, or why close friends often find themselves laughing at the exact same moment. Skilled negotiators sometimes use mirroring deliberately to build cooperation, while therapists use it to deepen a sense of safety in a room. When it's forced or exaggerated, though, it can feel hollow rather than warm. In its truest, most natural form, mirroring is simply the body's quiet way of saying, without a single word, I'm with you. Two nervous systems moving gently in time with one another. Think of something small you're looking forward to tomorrow. A coffee made a particular way, a message from someone you miss, a quiet morning with absolutely nowhere to be. And notice the small lift that arrives in your chest just from picturing it now. The brain treats anticipated pleasure almost identically to pleasure itself. Simply looking forward to something can trigger a rise in the same reward chemistry that occurs during the actual experience, which is part of why planning something enjoyable can lift your mood for days before it even happens. Studies on savoring suggest that deliberately pausing to imagine a good moment in detail beforehand can extend the pleasure of it considerably. Think of the anticipation the night before a trip, packing a bag slowly, already halfway somewhere else in your mind, long before the car has even left the driveway. In its quiet generosity, the mind doesn't always wait for the good thing to arrive. Sometimes it begins the celebration early, softly, in the private, unhurried space of imagination alone. It sounds almost impossible, but studies show that a placebo, an inactive treatment with nothing in it at all, can still produce real, measurable effects, even when the person taking it knows clearly that it isn't real medicine. In these cases, simply understanding that the body has its own capacity to heal seems to be enough to create genuine changes, like reduced pain or an improved mood. Psychologists suggest this works through expectation and conditioning together. The ritual of treatment itself, combined with a quiet belief in the body's own resources, act activates pathways in the brain that influence physical states directly. Think of the comfort some people feel simply from taking a vitamin each morning, a small ritual that steadies the day regardless of its exact biochemical effect. This open-label placebo effect reveals just how deeply intertwined the mind and body really are, and how belief alone can shape biology even without any deception involved at all. It's a quiet reminder that sometimes awareness itself can be its own gentle form of medicine. Think of an old worry, a small humiliation from years ago, a mistake at work nobody but you remembers anymore. And notice with something like relief that it barely visits you these days. Forgetting can feel like a flaw in the mind, but it's actually an essential part of how memory works at all. The brain takes in an overwhelming amount of information constantly, and letting go of the least useful details helps make room for whatever matters most right now. Psychologists believe forgetting allows us to generalize from past experience, rather than getting endlessly tangled in specifics that no longer serve us. It also quietly prevents outdated information from interfering with new learning as life continues to move forward. Think of it like pruning a tree, removing the old, dead branches so the healthy ones have room to keep growing toward the light. Far from being a weakness, the ability to forget is one of the mind's quiet ways of staying focused, ensuring the memories you carry are the ones still worth carrying. Think of the mornings you wake up with somewhere to be, someone waiting on you, some small reason pulling you gently out of bed, and compare that honestly to the mornings that feel entirely without shape or purpose. Research shows that people with a strong sense of purpose, some clear reason to get up each day, often live longer, healthier lives than those without one. Purpose seems to provide motivation, which in turn encourages healthier habits, reduces stress, and strengthens social connection over time. Some studies have even linked a sense of purpose to lower levels of inflammation and better cardiovascular health, as if the body itself responds to having somewhere to point itself. This doesn't need to be grand or world-changing. It can be as personal as caring for someone you love, tending a garden, or simply showing up for a small commitment each week. Think of the quiet steadiness that comes from having one small, reliable reason to greet the morning. In hard seasons, purpose can act like a distant light on the horizon, a reason to keep moving forward, one unremarkable day at a time. Long-term practice of meditation has been shown to physically change the brain, not metaphorically, but in ways visible on an MRI scan. Studies have found increased thickness in the prefrontal cortex, an area tied to decision-making and self-control, along with changes in the hippocampus, which plays a central role in memory and learning. Regular meditation has also been linked to a smaller amygdala, the brain's center for fear and stress, suggesting a genuinely greater capacity for calm over time. These structural changes reflect neuroplasticity, the brain's remarkable ability to rewire itself in response to repeated experience. Even a few quiet minutes a day can begin to shift these neural patterns gradually, improving attention, emotional steadiness, and a general sense of well-being. Think of the first time you sat quietly for even 5 minutes, restless, unsure what you were doing, and how weeks later, that same stillness started to feel less like an effort and more like coming home. In a world that so often feels rushed and loud, meditation offers a quiet way to reshape the mind from the inside. One calm breath folded gently into the next. Think of studying for something important the night before, cramming every detail into a single exhausted evening, versus spreading that same material gently across several quiet nights instead. Spacing learning out over time rather than absorbing it all at once leads to noticeably better long-term retention, something psychologists call the spacing effect. This works because each review strengthens the memory a little further, and the gap between sessions allows just enough forgetting to occur that recalling the information again requires real effort. That small effort is exactly what reinforces the neural pathway, making the memory more durable than it would have been otherwise. Think of a language you tried to learn once through frantic, last-minute repetition, and how little of it remains now, compared to something you learned slowly, a little at a time, over months. It's the difference between writing in wet sand at the shoreline and carving something quietly into stone. Brain imaging has revealed something strange, that neural activity can sometimes predict a decision seconds before a person becomes consciously aware of having made it at all. This suggests that much of what we experience as deliberate choice may actually begin in unconscious processing, with conscious awareness arriving only afterward to claim ownership of it. This doesn't mean free will is simply an illusion, but it does reveal that awareness is only one part of a much larger decision-making system working quietly beneath the surface. Think of a moment you just knew what you were going to order, or which street you'd turn down, before you'd consciously weighed a single option. The mind, in that sense, works like a deep ocean, where the surface waves of conscious thought are shaped by unseen currents moving far below, currents we rarely get to see directly. For a small number of people, certain sounds automatically trigger the perception of color, a condition called synesthesia. A particular musical note might appear in the mind's eye as a burst of deep blue, or a spoken word might arrive carrying a faint, consistent haze of green. These associations tend to be remarkably consistent for each individual, and often begin very early in life, sometimes as far back as anyone can remember. Neuroscientists believe this blending of senses happens because of increased connectivity between brain regions that, for most people, process sound and color entirely separately. While synesthesia is uncommon, it offers a quiet glimpse into just how flexible perception can be, weaving rich, layered experiences from a world most of us experience through more separated channels. For those who have it, music isn't only heard, it's seen, like watching a private, silent display of color, unfolding with every note. Reframing a stressful situation, choosing to look at it from a slightly different angle, can genuinely lower its emotional weight, a process psychologists call cognitive reappraisal. It works by quietly changing the meaning attached to an event, viewing a challenge as an opportunity to grow, for instance, rather than as a threat looming over you. Brain scans show that this kind of reappraisal activates the prefrontal cortex, which in turn helps regulate the amygdala, the brain's fear center, calming its response almost in real time. This shift doesn't erase the difficulty itself, but it creates a small space between the stimulus and the reaction, room enough for a calmer response to arrive. Think of a hard season you once lived through, and how, looking back now, you can sometimes see the exact moment your own thinking about it quietly shifted from dread into something closer to determination. Over time, the habit of reappraisal can make the mind more resilient, slowly turning old stress into an unlikely kind of teacher. It seems almost backwards, but a mildly tired brain can sometimes think more creatively than a fully alert one. When we're a little fatigued, the mind's usual filters loosen slightly, allowing more unusual, unexpected connections to surface freely than they would under sharp, rigid focus. This can be especially useful for tasks requiring divergent thinking, brainstorming, inventing, or solving a problem in a way nobody else has quite tried yet. Psychologists suggest the relaxed control of a tired mind frees it from overly rigid patterns, opening a door to genuinely novel ideas. Think of the strange, oddly brilliant thought that sometimes arrives right at the edge of sleep, half-formed, half-dreamed, and gone by morning if you don't write it down quickly enough. It's one reason so many people find their most original ideas late at night, or early in the soft gray light of morning, when thought drifts just a little more freely than usual. Picture a room full of people confidently agreeing on an answer you privately believe is wrong, and noticing, almost against your will, how tempting it becomes to simply nod along instead of speaking up. Group consensus is a powerful force, often nudging individuals toward positions they might never have chosen entirely on their own. Classic psychological experiments found that people will sometimes give an obviously incorrect answer to a simple question, purely because everyone else in the group had already done the same. This pull toward agreement tends to grow stronger when the group appears unanimous, or when a person feels uncertain of their own judgment. While conformity can support cooperation, it can also quietly suppress creativity and honest dissent when it goes unchecked. Recognizing this pull allows you to pause, gently, and ask whether your agreement reflects your own genuine belief, or simply a quiet wish to avoid standing out. Sometimes the most important voice to listen for, in a room full of confident agreement, is the quiet one that sounds like your own. Receiving a genuine compliment can activate the brain's reward centers in strikingly similar ways to receiving money or winning something you wanted. Regions like the striatum respond warmly to social praise, releasing dopamine and fostering a small, real lift in mood that lingers longer than the moment itself. Compliments can also improve performance directly, since encouragement tends to boost both motivation and confidence in whatever comes next. This is part of why sincere positive feedback is such a quietly powerful tool in teaching, teamwork, and close relationships alike. The effect isn't limited to elaborate praise either. Even a small, honest acknowledgement can spark this same response in someone. Think of a compliment someone once gave you, offhand, almost in passing, that you still remember clearly years later, long after they've likely forgotten saying it at all. At its core, a compliment is both recognition and connection, a small way of telling someone, quietly, that they are seen. The mind's ability to simulate experience extends even to sensations we've never personally endured ourselves. Simply watching someone in pain, or reading a vivid enough description of it, can activate some of the very same brain regions involved in our own direct pain processing. This capacity likely evolved to strengthen empathy, helping us understand and avoid the suffering of others without needing to experience every danger firsthand. While imagined pain isn't as intense as the real thing, the overlap in brain activity can still be strong enough to make us wince genuinely at someone else's small injury. Think of flinching involuntarily at a scene in a film, even knowing with complete certainty that nothing on screen was ever real. This same capacity also means that anticipated pain, fear of what might happen, can shape our choices well before any actual harm has ever occurred. A lack of proper sleep can severely impair the brain's ability to store new information at all. During deep sleep, the hippocampus works quietly to consolidate the day's memories, transferring them gently into longer-term storage while the body rests. Without sufficient rest, this process becomes disrupted, leaving the mind far less able to hold on to details from the day that just passed. Even a single night of poor sleep can measurably weaken both learning and recall in the days that follow it. Chronic sleep deprivation over time can lead to more lasting cognitive difficulties that don't simply resolve after one good night's rest. Think of a foggy, disoriented morning after a night of almost no sleep at all, and how even simple tasks seem to require far more effort than they should have. Rest, it turns out, isn't only good for the body, it's essential for the mind's ability to write the story of each day into something lasting. In certain situations, groups tend to make bolder, riskier decisions than any individual within that group would likely make alone, a pattern called group polarization. Discussion within a group often amplifies whatever opinion was already dominant, and shared enthusiasm can quietly downplay potential risks that a single, more cautious voice might have noticed. This effect shows up everywhere, from business meetings to casual friend groups planning something a little reckless together. While collective decision-making can genuinely draw on diverse perspectives, it can also create a kind of risky momentum, where the desire for unity quietly outweighs caution. Being aware of this tendency allows groups to counterbalance it deliberately, encouraging dissenting voices and building in a pause before acting. Think of a decision made in an excited group setting that, looking back later, might have gone differently with just one more quiet, careful voice in the room. In the end, the group mind is a genuinely powerful tool, but like any tool, it requires care in how it's used. Optical illusions work precisely because the brain doesn't merely receive raw sensory input, it actively interprets it, filling gaps and constantly making predictions about what should logically be there. When those predictions clash with the actual incoming data, the result can be an image that appears to shift, move, or hide details that are, in fact, sitting in plain sight the entire time. Illusions reveal the quiet shortcuts the brain relies on to make sense of the world quickly, shortcuts that usually serve us extremely well in ordinary life. They remind us that what we see is always a version of reality, reconstructed carefully inside our own heads, rather than reality captured directly and objectively. Think of staring at a familiar illusion, knowing exactly how it works and still, somehow, being unable to stop your mind from seeing the trick anyway. Every perception, in a sense, is a personalized rendering, shaped quietly by past experience, expectation, and the context surrounding it. Laughter isn't merely a passing reaction. It functions almost like a kind of mental exercise that can genuinely build resilience over time. When we laugh, the brain releases endorphins and reduces circulating stress hormones, creating a physiological state that makes it noticeably easier to cope with whatever challenge comes next. Shared laughter also strengthens social bonds directly, building a network of support that becomes especially valuable during harder seasons of life. Over time, these small moments of joy function almost like repeated training sessions for the nervous system, teaching it to recover more quickly from stress than it otherwise would. Think of an evening with old friends where the laughter came so easily and so often that, for a few hours, whatever had been weighing on you simply couldn't find room to surface. In this way, laughter becomes more than a fleeting pleasure. It becomes a quiet resource stored within the body, ready to be called upon exactly when life demands a little more courage than usual. Deep within the brain's temporal lobe lies a highly specialized region called the fusiform face area, devoted almost entirely to recognizing human faces. This network is so finely tuned that it can identify a familiar face in a crowd in less than a second, often before conscious thought has even caught up to confirm it. Damage to this specific area can result in a condition called prosopagnosia, or face blindness, where a person can see every individual facial feature clearly, yet struggle to recognize even close friends or family members. The importance of this system likely traces back through evolutionary history, since reading faces quickly has long been vital for detecting emotion, recognizing allies, and building meaningful social bonds. Remarkably, this same network doesn't only process human faces, it can adapt to recognize other deeply familiar patterns too. The shape of a beloved pet, the particular curve of a well-loved object. Think of glancing across a crowded room and finding someone you love instantly, without any conscious searching at all, as though your mind had already been quietly scanning for them the entire time. Handwriting engages the brain quite differently from typing, drawing on fine motor skill, visual processing, and spatial awareness all at the same time. This richer, more layered sensory experience helps encode information more deeply, making it genuinely easier to recall later on. Students who take handwritten notes often remember concepts better than those who type, even when they write noticeably less overall, largely because summarizing by hand in real time demands more active engagement with the material itself. Writing by hand also naturally slows the pace of thought, giving the mind extra time to actually process each idea as it arrives. Think of an old handwritten letter you've kept somewhere, the particular slant of the handwriting, and how holding it feels entirely different from reading the same words typed on a screen. While typing remains fast and efficient, handwriting can function like a quiet form of mindful learning, each stroke a small physical imprint of thought, etched not only onto paper but gently into the neural patterns of memory itself. While trauma can cause genuinely deep and lasting pain, some people emerge from it with greater resilience, deeper empathy, or a renewed sense of purpose entirely, a phenomenon psychologists call post-traumatic growth. This doesn't suggest that the trauma itself was somehow beneficial, only that recovery can sometimes foster strengths that might never have developed otherwise under easier circumstances. Psychologists have identified areas where this growth commonly appears: stronger relationships, a deeper appreciation for ordinary life, and a closer connection to one's own values. The process often involves what's called meaning-making, quietly finding a way to integrate the experience into a larger, ongoing story of one's life. Think of someone you know who went through something genuinely difficult, and how years later, a certain steadiness in them seems directly traceable back to that hard season, even though none of them would ever ask for it to happen again. While not everyone experiences this kind of growth, those who do often describe it as a quiet transformation, forged slowly, like a tree growing stronger after surviving a storm it never chose. In a curious twist of psychology, simply believing you've slept well can genuinely improve your performance and mood the next day, even if your actual sleep was poor. In one study, participants who were told they'd had above-average sleep quality performed noticeably better on cognitive tasks, regardless of how much they had actually slept the night before. This effect, sometimes called placebo sleep, shows just how powerfully expectation alone can shape both mental and physical states. The brain appears to use belief as a kind of shortcut, adjusting energy and focus based on perceived rest rather than measured rest. Of course, genuine sleep remains irreplaceable for real, long-term health. Think of a morning after a rough night where someone told you that you looked well-rested, and how, oddly, you felt a little more capable almost immediately afterward. It suggests that part of feeling rested comes not only from hours slept, but from the quiet story we tell ourselves about that rest. Many people have experienced the strange, almost uncanny feeling of being watched, only to turn and find, unmistakably, that it's true. While science hasn't fully explained this sensation, some research suggests subtle cues, a shift in shadow, a change in peripheral vision, even a faint sound, may alert us unconsciously before we're aware of noticing anything at all. The brain seems finely tuned to detect social attention, since knowing when eyes were on you has mattered throughout human history for both safety and connection. Evolutionary psychologists suggest this sensitivity likely helped early humans avoid danger and navigate complex social situations quickly. Think of walking down an empty street at night and turning around for no clear reason, only to notice someone genuinely was there behind you. Whether through subtle perception or a deeper, older instinct, the sensation can be compelling enough to prompt action before conscious thought has even caught up to explain it. Posture, small gestures, and micro-expressions often reveal emotions we haven't consciously acknowledged to ourselves yet. Crossed arms might quietly signal defensiveness, while a subtle shift in tone can indicate unease long before words catch up to the feeling. Psychologists note these cues are sometimes visible to other people before they're even clear to the person experiencing them, offering an external mirror of an internal state still coming into focus. Becoming aware of your own body language can reveal hidden stress, quiet excitement, or unspoken attraction you hadn't fully named yet. Likewise, learning to read someone else's nonverbal signals can deepen empathy considerably. Think of a friend who insisted they were fine while their whole posture said otherwise, and how you somehow trusted their shoulders more than their words. This silent language runs in parallel with speech, and sometimes, quietly, speaks more honestly than anything actually said aloud. In a lucid dream, you become aware that you are dreaming, and with that awareness, you can sometimes begin to shape the dream itself. People who experience lucid dreaming report flying over mountains, breathing underwater, or gently rewriting the events of a dream as it happens around them. Psychologists believe lucid dreams arise when parts of the brain linked to self-awareness become active during sleep, layered on top of the dream state itself. For some, these moments happen naturally, while others train themselves through techniques like reality checks or keeping a dream journal by the bed. Research even suggests that skills practiced within lucid dreams can carry over, subtly, into improved performance while awake. Think of the strange comfort in realizing, mid-dream, that you are safe, that none of it can truly hurt you, and choosing to stay a little longer anyway. It's a quiet reminder that the mind can build entire worlds rich with feeling, worlds we can walk through as both the traveler and the architect. Think of a task you stepped away from before finishing, and how it kept quietly resurfacing in your thoughts for the rest of the day, long after you'd physically moved on to something else. This is called the Zeigarnik effect, our tendency to hold on to incomplete tasks far more vividly than completed ones. This mental open loop likely evolved to help us remember what still needs doing, but it can also keep us awake at night, replaying conversations or reminding us of unfinished work. Studies suggest this happens because unresolved tasks create a small, persistent tension, and finishing the task is what finally releases it. This is part of why writing a simple to-do list can feel strangely calming. It signals to the brain that the task has been accounted for, even before it's actually done. Think of the relief of finally sending an email you'd been avoiding for days, a weightlifting before you'd even received a reply. Either way, it's a quiet example of the mind's endless unfinished business, and how simply naming it can loosen its grip. The act of feeling and expressing gratitude is more than a polite habit. It can genuinely shift the body's own chemistry. Studies have found that people who regularly focus on what they're thankful for show measurably lower levels of cortisol, the hormone released during stress. Gratitude practices like keeping a small journal or reflecting quietly before sleep have also been linked to increased activity in brain regions tied to empathy and joy. This isn't only a pleasant shift in mood, it's a physiological response that can strengthen immune function and even support better sleep quality over time. Psychologists suggest gratitude works by shifting attention away from what feels lacking and toward what already feels abundant, creating a quiet sense of safety. Think of the last time you named, even silently, 3 small things you were grateful for, and noticed your breathing slow slightly as you did. A grateful thought, held quietly for even a moment, can ripple through the nervous system like a slow, calming tide. Sometimes the mind reacts to messages it never consciously notices at all, a phenomenon psychologists call subliminal priming. The presentation of a stimulus so brief or subtle that it falls beneath conscious awareness can still measurably influence thought or behavior afterward. In one study, flashing positive or negative words for only milliseconds before showing a neutral image changed how participants rated that image's emotional tone entirely. Advertisers and artists have long been fascinated by this effect, though its real influence tends to be far subtler than popular myths suggest. Still, it reveals something important. Our conscious mind is not the only gatekeeper of perception at work. Beneath awareness, the brain is constantly scanning, filtering, and quietly interpreting signals we never notice directly. Most of these impressions never surface into words at all, but they can tilt a decision, shape an impression, or leave us with a feeling we can't quite explain. Whispers arriving from just past the edge of perception. A song from years ago can pull you instantly back to a particular hallway, a summer afternoon, or a person you haven't spoken to in a long while. Music has a uniquely powerful relationship with memory because it engages multiple parts of the brain simultaneously: auditory regions, motor areas, and the limbic system all at once. The rhythm, melody, and lyrics weave together into a rich context, and when that same song plays again, the original emotion often returns with it, fully intact. For people living with memory loss, familiar music can sometimes awaken moments of real clarity, allowing them to sing along to lyrics they otherwise couldn't recall at all. Psychologists believe music works as a powerful retrieval cue, one that quietly bypasses some of the barriers that time usually creates. Think of a song you can't hear anymore without immediately thinking of one specific person, as though the melody had been waiting patiently to hand you that memory back. It's proof that even when memories feel lost, they can still be carried gently within us, waiting for the right note to set them free. Human beings evolved in small social groups, where knowing who could be trusted often meant the difference between safety and real danger. This may explain why our brains are tuned to remember gossip, stories about other people's behavior, more readily than neutral, unrelated facts. In experiments, people consistently recall details about untrustworthy behavior far more easily than physical descriptions or ordinary events. Gossip activates the brain's social reasoning networks directly, drawing attention and helping the information stay stored for future use. While gossip can certainly be harmful when spread carelessly, it can also serve a quiet protective function, helping groups maintain shared norms and avoid unnecessary risk. Think of how quickly a piece of news about someone travels through a group, compared to an ordinary fact nobody has any particular stake in. Whether whispered around a fire thousands of years ago or shared quietly today, gossip's staying power lies in the brain's deep, ancient interest in the behavior of others. That eerie feeling that you've somehow lived a moment before, déjà vu, is still not fully understood by science. One leading theory suggests it occurs when the brain's recognition system briefly misfires, creating a false sense of familiarity in an otherwise entirely new moment. This may happen when a new experience closely matches patterns from past memory, even if the original moment can't actually be recalled directly. Neuroimaging studies suggest the temporal lobe, particularly regions involved in memory, plays a central role in this brief, strange overlap. For most people, déjà vu passes quickly and remains harmless, but it offers a small glimpse into how the brain constantly stitches together present and past experience. Think of the last time it happened to you. That flicker of doubled reality, gone again within seconds, leaving only a faint, unplaceable unease behind. It's a quiet reminder that perception isn't a perfect record, but an interpretation. And sometimes the mind's own storyteller simply gets ahead of itself. When anxiety rises, the speed of our speech often rises with it, driven partly by the body's fight or flight response, which quickens both heart rate and breathing. The brain, primed for rapid action, pushes thoughts forward more quickly than the mouth can comfortably keep pace with. Nervous speakers may skip pauses entirely, rush through sentences, or stumble over words as adrenaline sharpens their urgency to be understood as quickly as possible. This effect can be subtle, a slight quickening of cadence, or pronounced enough that the words blur together almost entirely. In social settings, fast talking can sometimes make others around you feel anxious too, as emotional states quietly ripple through a group. Think of a nervous phone call you once made, hearing your own words tumbling out faster than you meant them to. Slowing speech down deliberately can calm the body directly, and a calmer body, in turn, can steady the mind that's driving it. For all our advances in neuroscience, vast regions of the human brain remain only partly understood even now. We can map structures, trace electrical signals, and observe patterns of activity in remarkable detail. Yet the deeper mystery of how consciousness itself arises still escapes precise explanation. Some brain regions have no fully defined function at all, and the intricate networks linking them together are more complex than any system humans have ever built. Every new study seems to reveal not only fresh answers, but new questions. A quiet reminder that we've explored only a small fraction of this living universe housed inside our own skulls. Think of the strange comfort in knowing that even the scientists studying your mind most closely still find it in places entirely mysterious. Like an ocean whose surface we've only skimmed, the brain holds entire continents of understanding still waiting to be found. Research suggests that the majority of our daily thoughts are simply recycled from previous days. Familiar concerns, routines, and reflections replaying themselves in slightly different form. This mental repetition helps maintain a sense of stability, but it can also quietly limit creativity and keep us circling old, well-worn patterns. The brain favors efficiency, and reusing an existing neural pathway is simply less demanding than forging a brand new one from scratch. However, when we intentionally seek out something novel, a new route, a new skill, a change of scenery, we can spark genuinely fresh patterns of thought. This is part of why travel, or even taking a different way home, can feel quietly invigorating in a way that's hard to explain. Think of the last small change you made to an ordinary routine, and how oddly alive it made an otherwise unremarkable day feel. Most of the time our thoughts flow along familiar trails, but every so often we can step off the path entirely and discover new ground within ourselves. Your eyes are most detailed directly in the center, but they're actually fastest at detecting motion out at the edges. Peripheral vision is finely attuned to movement, a survival trait dating back to when noticing a sudden rustle nearby could mean spotting a predator or prey in time to react. This sensitivity is tied closely to specialized cells in the outer retina, which are better suited to detecting light and motion in low-contrast conditions. In modern life, this simply means you might notice something moving in the corner of eye well before you consciously turn to look at it directly. It's part of the brain's ancient early warning system, scanning constantly for change, ready to pull your focus wherever it's suddenly needed most. Think of the flicker of motion that made you turn your head tonight, before you even knew what you were turning toward. In the quiet margins of your sight, an old watchtower still keeps its patient, ancient guard. Simply placing an image of a pair of eyes near a donation box, even one printed and entirely unrealistic, can make people behave more generously and more honestly nearby. Psychologists believe this happens because the sensation of being watched triggers a sense of social accountability, even when the eyes in question are only ink on paper. This effect appears rooted in our evolutionary past, when reputation and group belonging were essential for survival, and being seen genuinely meant your actions mattered to others. Interestingly, the eyes don't even need to look realistic for the effect to hold. Even simple stylized designs can trigger the same quiet shift in behavior. Think of how differently you might act, even briefly, if you felt certain someone unseen was watching you make a small choice right now. It's a small, strange example of how deep social instinct continues to shape behavior in ways we rarely notice, turning a simple image into an invisible, silent reminder that someone somewhere might be watching. The warmth of a hand on your shoulder, or someone simply holding your hand, can do far more than offer comfort. It can genuinely change how your brain perceives pain itself. Physical touch activates sensory pathways that quietly compete with pain signals, softening their intensity as they travel. It also triggers a release of oxytocin, the hormone closely tied to bonding and stress reduction, easing the body almost immediately. In one study, couples who held hands during a painful moment not only reported less discomfort, their brainwaves actually began to synchronize with each other. This suggests touch doesn't only soothe emotionally, it can create a shared physiological state that eases suffering directly. Think of a hand quietly placed on your back during a hard week, offering nothing but its presence, and how that alone seemed to help. In moments of distress, a gentle touch can act as both shield and anchor, reminding the body wordlessly that it isn't alone. Smells often bypass conscious thought entirely, traveling almost directly to brain regions tied to emotion and memory. This direct route means scent can quietly influence mood and behavior without us ever realizing it's happening at all. In experiments, pleasant ambient scents placed in stores have been shown to increase the likelihood of a purchase, while the smell of cleaning products alone can make people tidy up more without noticing why. These subtle effects work because scent can prime certain thoughts or associations before conscious reasoning ever gets involved. Lavender may quietly induce calm, Citrus may signal freshness and energy, all beneath awareness. Think of walking into a space that simply felt good for reasons you couldn't quite name, only to realize later it was something in the air the entire time. While we often think of our choices as purely rational, invisible sensory cues can tip the scales more than we'd ever like to admit. Switching between tasks might feel efficient, but it often comes at a real cost to memory accuracy. When attention is divided, the brain can't fully encode the details of either task, which leads to weaker, less reliable recall of both afterward. Multitasking also increases the chance of source confusion, remembering a piece of information but forgetting entirely where it actually came from. Over time, habitual multitasking can train the brain to favor breadth over depth, making sustained, focused attention noticeably harder to access. Psychologists generally recommend monotasking instead, dedicating real time to one activity for better learning and retention. Think of a conversation you only half listened to while scrolling a phone, and how little of it you can actually recall now, despite being present the entire time. The mind is sharpest when allowed to dwell deeply on a single thread, weaving it securely into memory rather than splitting it thin. Time perception is remarkably fluid, shaped constantly by attention, emotion, and novelty, rather than ticking along at a fixed, even pace. Moments of danger or intense focus can feel noticeably longer as the brain records more sensory detail per second than usual. Conversely, familiar routines can seem to vanish quickly, entire hours passing in what feels like only minutes. This effect helps explain why childhood often seems to stretch on endlessly. Every experience still new, while adulthood can feel like it's moving faster, as novelty naturally decreases. Psychologists suggest that deliberately seeking out new experiences can slow the perceived passage of time, adding richness back into otherwise routine days. Think of a single new experience, a new city, a new hobby, that made an entire week feel longer and fuller than a typical month at home. In this way, our sense of time behaves less like a clock and more like an accordion, expanding and contracting with the music of what we're actually living. False memories aren't simply fuzzy or uncertain. They can feel every bit as vivid and detailed as memories of things that genuinely happened. Experiments have shown that suggestion, imagination, and even doctored photographs can lead people to confidently remember events that never actually occurred at all. The brain builds memory by reconstructing details each time it's recalled, meaning those details can shift subtly with each retelling over time. This flexibility is normally useful, allowing memory to adapt, but it also leaves it genuinely open to distortion in ways we rarely notice happening. In some cases, people can recall entire fabricated scenarios with complete confidence, full emotions, and sensory detail included. Think of a family story you've always been certain you remember firsthand, only to realize, on reflection, you were far too young to have actually witnessed it yourself. Memory isn't a perfect archive. It's a story the mind tells, and like any story, it can quietly change in the telling. Everyone has a small blind spot where the optic nerve meets the retina, yet almost no one ever notices it in daily life. This is because the brain automatically fills in the missing information using surrounding visual detail and learned pattern, seamlessly in real time. This filling in process happens constantly, not only at the blind spot, quietly smoothing over small gaps caused by blinking, shadow, or momentary obstruction. Most of the time, the result feels completely seamless, but it means what we see is partly a construction rather than a direct, unfiltered capture of reality. In this way, the brain behaves almost like a quiet editor, presenting a polished version of the world instead of raw, untouched footage. Think of how confidently you trust your own eyes, even knowing now that a small part of what you see always is simply filled in by assumption. We live inside a picture shaped as much by interpretation as it is by actual light. Your own name functions almost like a personal alarm bell for the brain, cutting through noise in a way few other sounds ever manage to. Even in a crowded, noisy room, hearing it spoken can capture your attention instantly, a phenomenon psychologists call the cocktail party effect. Brain scans show that hearing your own name triggers heightened activity in the medial prefrontal cortex, a region closely tied to self-awareness and identity. This reaction is automatic and often quietly emotional, since names are deeply woven into both identity and social connection. This sensitivity likely evolved because recognizing when someone was addressing you directly could once mean safety, opportunity, or urgent information. Think of hearing your own name whispered from across a loud, crowded room, and how your whole attention pivoted before you even consciously decided to listen. Even from a distance, your name carries a quiet power to pierce through distraction and pull you gently back into the present moment. Biases aren't always deliberate or even conscious. The brain's habit of forming quick impressions and sorting information can lead to implicit associations operating entirely below awareness. These hidden associations can influence decisions, perceptions, and interactions, even in people who genuinely value fairness and equal treatment. Tests designed to reveal implicit bias show that these associations can be surprisingly resistant to change through willpower alone. But awareness itself is the necessary first step toward countering them in any meaningful way. By slowing decisions down, seeking out different perspectives, and gently questioning first reactions, we can begin to weaken these hidden patterns over time. Think of a moment you caught yourself reacting to someone before you'd consciously thought anything at all, and paused, quietly, to ask where that reaction had actually come from. It's a bit like learning to spot a current running beneath the surface of a river. Once you know it's there, you can choose, more carefully, how to navigate it. Far from being a sign of distraction, doodling can actually support concentration rather than undermine it. In one study, participants who doodled quietly while listening to a dull recording remembered more of the details afterward than those who sat with hands entirely still. This mild, repetitive engagement may prevent the mind from fully wandering off, keeping it gently anchored to the primary task at hand. This works because attention has a limited overall capacity, and a small, repetitive activity can absorb unused mental space without pulling focus away from what actually matters. For some people, doodling during a lecture or long meeting functions like a quiet tether between wandering thought and the information in front of them. Think of the margins of an old notebook, filled with small, absent-minded shapes drawn during a class you somehow remember more clearly than others. In the quiet strokes of a pen, attention often finds its own steady rhythm. What we call taste is really a blend of flavor and aroma working together, far more than most people realize while eating. The tongue alone can only detect 5 basic sensations: sweet, salty, sour, bitter, and umami, while the thousands of subtle flavors we actually perceive come mostly from smell. When you eat with a blocked nose, food often tastes strangely bland, simply because those aromatic signals are missing from the experience entirely. The brain fuses taste and smell together into a single unified experience, processed in regions closely tied to both memory and emotion. This is part of why certain flavors can instantly transport you back to a specific place or time, decades later, fully intact. Think of a meal that instantly returned you to your grandmother's kitchen, the taste inseparable from the particular warmth of that room. In every bite, the senses quietly work together to create something richer than either could manage entirely alone. Certain fears, snakes, spiders, heights, appear more readily in humans and other primates, even without any direct negative experience to explain them. Psychologists and evolutionary biologists believe these fears are prepared through evolution, offering our ancestors a real survival advantage in avoiding genuine danger. Studies have shown that people develop fear responses to these particular stimuli far more quickly than to neutral objects, like flowers or ordinary household items. While modern life has made many of these old dangers far less relevant day to day, the underlying predisposition still quietly remains within us. This evolutionary inheritance means our emotional responses aren't shaped only by personal experience, but by an entire long history of survival encoded into the nervous system. Think of an instinctive flinch at something harmless looking that simply resembled a spider from across a room, faster than any conscious thought could arrive. Sometimes our instincts are simply whispers carried forward from a past where a single moment's caution meant the difference between life and death. During near-death experiences, deep meditation, or even certain kinds of targeted brain stimulation, some people report feeling as though they've left their own body, observing themselves from above or from a distance. Neuroscientists have linked these experiences to disruptions in how the brain integrates sensory information, particularly around a region called the temporal parietal junction. While often brief, these moments can feel remarkably vivid and profoundly real, leaving a lasting impression on those who experience them. Out-of-body perceptions can shift a person's sense of identity considerably, and often deepen existential curiosity about the nature of consciousness itself. Whether understood as a neurological phenomenon or something else entirely, they highlight the brain's remarkable role in constructing the felt sense of self. Think of the strange, quiet awe in imagining, even briefly, what it might feel like to watch your own life from just slightly outside it. Under the right conditions, the sense of self that feels so solid every day can apparently gently untether from the physical form that holds it. Explaining a concept to someone else requires organizing your thoughts clearly, finding simple language, and anticipating questions, all of which quietly deepen your own grasp of the material in the process. This is sometimes called the protégé effect, and it's part of why teachers so often say they learn as much from teaching as their students do from listening. When you teach something, you actively retrieve and reconstruct the knowledge yourself, strengthening the exact neural pathways where it's stored. Even the simple process of preparing to teach something can improve retention, since the brain engages with the material in a more structured, purposeful way. This works for practical skills as well as plain facts. Showing a friend how to cook a dish reinforces your own muscle memory for it too. Think of the last time you explained something you loved to someone new, and noticed quietly how much clearer it became in your own mind by the end. In teaching, knowledge stops being something you simply hold and becomes something you genuinely live. In a now famous set of experiments, people wore special glasses that inverted their entire field of vision, turning the world completely upside down. At first, the experience was deeply disorienting, but within a matter of days, the brain gradually adjusted, and objects began to feel right side up again, despite the image entering the eyes still being reversed. This remarkable flexibility is a clear example of neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to reorganize itself in direct response to new incoming information. When the glasses were finally removed, vision felt flipped once again, until the brain readjusted a second time back to normal. This finding shows that perception isn't a fixed recording at all, but an active, ongoing construction, continually shaped by the brain's interpretation of raw sensory data. Think of how quickly your own mind adapts to something initially strange, a new home, a new routine, until it simply becomes the new normal without you noticing the shift happen. Even something as fundamental as up and down is, in part, simply a matter of adaptation. Becoming fully absorbed in a story, a novel, a film, someone else's account of their own life, can temporarily shift the boundaries of your own sense of self. Psychologists call this narrative transportation, the experience of becoming so immersed in a story that your own thoughts and emotions begin to align, briefly, with those of the characters inside it. During deep transportation, activity in brain regions tied to self-referential thinking can actually decrease, as though the usual boundary between watching and living loosens slightly. This is part of why a particularly moving film or book can leave you feeling different, gentler, more reflective, even after it's ended and the room has gone quiet again. Psychologists have found this effect can genuinely increase empathy afterward, since briefly inhabiting another perspective tends to soften our sense of separation from other people. Think of finishing a book so completely absorbing that, for a moment, you had to remember which life was actually your own again. For a little while, the mind is willing to lend itself entirely to someone else's story, and comes back changed, however slightly, for having gone. Think of trying to fall asleep while your mind is racing, replaying every small detail of the day, and how, in that exact moment, focusing on a series of random, unrelated words can suddenly quiet the noise. This is called cognitive shuffling, a technique designed to trick the brain into thinking it's already entering the dream state. When we're alert, our thoughts are logical and structured, but as we drift off, they become scattered and associative. By deliberately visualizing a sequence of random objects, an apple, a feather, a key, a lantern, we mimic this natural transition, signaling to the sleep centers in the brain that it is safe to shut down. Think of the last time you lay awake, desperately trying to force your mind to go quiet, only to find the effort itself made you more alert. By shifting your attention to simple, non-threatening images, you break the cycle of logical worry and allow your consciousness to gently untether, drifting smoothly into the dark. Imagine walking into a room and meeting someone who is exceptionally warm and attractive, and finding yourself automatically assuming they are also intelligent, honest, and kind before they've even spoken. This is known as the halo effect, a cognitive bias where our overall impression of a person warps how we judge their specific character traits. The brain, constantly looking for quick ways to evaluate others, uses one positive attribute to cast a golden light over everything else about them. This shortcut likely helped early humans identify potential allies quickly, but in modern life, it can lead us to overlook flaws or make unfair assumptions about those who don't fit our visual expectations. Think of a time you were surprised to learn that someone you initially found intimidating was actually incredibly gentle and insecure. It's a quiet reminder that our first impressions are often just stories we've spun from a single thread of detail, and that getting to know someone truly requires looking past the surface. Think of a vacation you took years ago and how, looking back now, you remember only the beautiful sunsets, the quiet dinners, and the laughter, while the long airport delays, the lost luggage, and the minor arguments have mostly faded away. This is called rosy retrospection, our tendency to remember past events more fondly than we actually experience them in the moment. During an experience, our attention is split between immediate physical discomforts and emotional highlights. But over time, the brain selectively prunes away the negative details, preserving the highlights to build a warmer, more coherent narrative of our lives. This distortion isn't a failure of memory. It's a vital tool for maintaining emotional resilience and optimism as we move forward. Think of how comforting it is to look back on a difficult season of your life and feel a sense of warmth anyway, realizing that your mind has quietly preserved the gold while letting the dust wash away. Think of someone you admire deeply, a teacher, a colleague, or a public figure, and how much more likable and human they suddenly seem to you when they made a small, clumsy mistake, like spilling a cup of coffee or stumbling over a word. This is known as the pratfall effect, the phenomenon where a highly competent person becomes measurably more attractive to others when they exhibit a minor blunder. If someone seems perfect, their competence can feel intimidating or distant, creating a subtle barrier to connection. But a small mistake breaks that illusion, making them feel relatable and safe. This effect only holds if the person is otherwise seen as capable. A blunder by someone already seen as clumsy doesn't have the same warm result. Think of how much pressure we put on ourselves to never show any weakness, when the truth is that our small, clumsy moments are often the very things that invite others to step closer and love us. Think of walking past someone who is crying quietly and noticing a sudden, sharp tightness in your own throat, as if the sadness belonged to you just as much as it did to them. Mirror neurons are specialized brain cells that fire both when we perform an action and when we observe someone else performing that same action, providing the physical foundation for empathy. Through this system, your brain literally simulates the experiences, movements, and emotions of the people around you, allowing you to feel what they feel in real time. This mirroring is automatic and incredibly fast, helping us understand others instinctively without needing to analyze their behavior logically first. Think of the comfort of being in a room with someone who is deeply calm, and how, without a single word spoken, their steadiness seemed to slowly settle into your own breathing. Your nervous system is constantly in dialogue with the world, always ready to borrow peace from whoever is close enough to share it. Think of the last time you spent an entire day completely alone in a quiet room with no phone, no notifications, and no plans, and how, after an initial period of restlessness, your thoughts started to feel more spacious and clear. Solitude is essential for the healthy maintenance of our self-concept, the internal narrative we build about who we are and what matters to us. In a world constantly demanding our attention and response, our sense of self can easily become fragmented, shaped entirely by the expectations and reactions of other people. When we step into absolute quiet, the external noise drops away, allowing the brain's default mode network to synthesize our experiences and restore a sense of inner unity. Think of how different you feel after a long, quiet walk in the woods compared to a busy afternoon in a crowded city. In the silence of your own company, you aren't empty. You're simply giving your mind the room it needs to find its own center again. Think back to a time you walked into a room with a tiny, almost unnoticeable stain on your shirt, completely certain that everyone in that room was staring at it, judging you, and talking about it behind your back. This is called the spotlight effect. Our tendency to grossly overestimate how much other people notice our appearance, our mistakes, and our behavior. Because we are the center of our own universe, we assume we are also the focus of everyone else's attention. But the reality is that other people are far too busy worrying about their own stains, their own words, and their own worries to notice ours. This mismatch can create immense, unnecessary anxiety, keeping us trapped in a constant state of self-consciousness. Think of how rarely you actually notice the small, clumsy blunders of the strangers you pass on the street each day, and let that realization bring a quiet sense of freedom. You are far more anonymous and far more permitted to be imperfect than your mind would ever lead you to believe. Think of a time you held a strong belief about something, only to be presented with clear, undeniable evidence that you were wrong, and the uncomfortable, almost physical tension that settled into your chest as you tried to make sense of it. This is called cognitive dissonance, the mental distress we experience when we hold two conflicting beliefs, or when our behavior contradicts our values. To resolve this painful tension, the brain will often go to extraordinary lengths, inventing justifications, ignoring facts, or rewriting memory just to restore a sense of inner consistency. This shortcut helps us feel stable, but it can also prevent us from growing or learning from our mistakes if we're not careful. Think of how hard it is to admit you were wrong, even to yourself, in the quiet of your own room. Recognizing this discomfort as a natural part of cognitive growth, rather than a threat, allows you to soften your grip on the need to be perfect and open your mind to the quiet truth. Think of a night where you slept only 3 or 4 hours, and how the next day, the smallest inconveniences, a dropped pen, a slow line, a minor misunderstanding, felt like insurmountable crises that made you want to cry or shout. Sleep deprivation causes an actual physiological uncoupling of the amygdala, the brain's emotional alarm system, from the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for logical control and emotional regulation. Without enough rest, the amygdala becomes hyperreactive, responding to ordinary, neutral events as if they were major threats, leaving you emotionally fragile and highly reactive. This is why a tired mind is so easily overwhelmed by worries that would feel completely manageable after a good night's rest. Think of how differently the world looks after a deep, uninterrupted sleep. How the giants of the night quietly shrink back into ordinary problems by morning. Rest is not a luxury. It is the literal foundation of your emotional steadiness, keeping the watchtower of your mind clear and calm. Think of an old song playing quietly on a radio somewhere, one you haven't heard since you were 10 years old, and how, within the first 3 notes, you can recall the exact smell of your childhood bedroom, the color of the curtains, and the feeling of that specific summer afternoon. Sound possesses a unique ability to lock and unlock memory because of how closely the auditory pathways are linked to the hippocampus and the amygdala. Unlike other sensory details that require complex processing, a simple rhythm or melody can act as a direct key, pulling entire scenes from the past into vivid focus all at once. This connection is so durable that music is often the very last memory pathway to fade, even in those experiencing profound cognitive decline. Think of a melody that always makes you feel a little safer, a little more grounded whenever you hear it. In the quiet notes of a song, the past remains fully alive, preserved gently for whenever you need to find your way back home. Think of a teacher or a mentor who genuinely believed in you, saw potential in you that you hadn't fully recognized yourself, and how their quiet expectation of your success actually helped you perform better than you thought possible. This is known as the Pygmalion effect, the psychological phenomenon where high expectations lead to an increase in performance, while low expectations can quietly pull it down. When someone we respect believes in us, their belief subtly alters our own self-image and motivation, encouraging us to take more risks, work harder, and persist through difficulties we might have otherwise avoided. This works in families, schools, and workplaces alike, showing how deeply our potential is connected to the warmth and support of the people around us. Think of the quiet confidence that settled into your chest the last time someone you trusted looked you in the eye and told you that you could do it. Sometimes the key to unlocking our own strength is simply borrowing the faith of someone who already sees it clearly. Try repeating a single ordinary word like house or candle or shadow out loud over and over again, 50 times in a row. And notice how after about 30 repetitions, the word starts to sound like absolute nonsense, its meaning dissolving entirely into a collection of strange, empty sounds. This is called semantic satiation, a psychological quirk where repeated stimulation causes our neural receptors to become temporarily fatigued, breaking the connection between the sound of a word and its meaning in the brain. For a few moments, a word you've used your entire life becomes completely unfamiliar, a foreign sound with no association at all. This effect reveals just how active the mind is in constructing meaning, constantly linking arbitrary sounds to complex concepts behind the scenes. Think of how comforting it is to realize that even the heaviest, most intimidating words in your mind can, with enough space and repetition, lose their power over you, turning back into nothing more than quiet, harmless whispers in the dark. Think of a time you walked into a stadium, a concert hall, or even a local community meeting, and felt an instant, warm sense of safety and belonging, simply from being surrounded by your people, even though you didn't know a single person's name. This is known as in-group bias, our ancient evolutionary hardwiring to trust and favor members of our own group over outsiders. Throughout human history, belonging to a reliable group was essential for survival, providing protection, food, and shared shelter, which is why our brains still release oxytocin and lower stress hormones when we feel surrounded by those we perceive as similar to us. While this instinct can sometimes lead to unnecessary division if left unexamined, It also highlights our deep, universal need for connection. Think of how much lighter the world feels when you find even one person who shares your quiet passion, your favorite book, or your specific worries. In that simple, shared understanding, our ancient fears of isolation quietly dissolve, replaced by the warm sanctuary of belonging. Imagine giving a presentation or having a difficult conversation with someone you care about, completely convinced that your nervousness, your racing heart, and your shaking hands are entirely visible to everyone in the room, only to have them tell you afterward that you looked completely calm. This is called the illusion of transparency, our tendency to overestimate how easily others can read our internal emotional states. Because we feel our own anxiety so intensely from the inside, we assume it must be leaking out for everyone else to see. But the reality is that our internal feelings are largely private, hidden behind a physical form that is remarkably good at maintaining a steady surface. This mismatch can create immense, unnecessary panic, as we worry about our own worry being seen. Think of the last time you watched someone speak, assuming they were a natural professional, only to learn later that they were trembling with nerves the entire time. Your secrets are safe and your surface is steadier than your racing thoughts will ever let you believe. Think of lying down to sleep after a long, exhausting day and feeling a warm, heavy relaxation slowly wash down from your face, into your shoulders, and all the way to your toes, as your breathing becomes deep and slow. Your autonomic nervous system is divided into two branches: the sympathetic, which drives the fight or flight response, and the parasympathetic, which regulates rest and recovery. For your body to enter deep, restorative sleep, the parasympathetic system must become dominant, sending safety signals through the vagus nerve to slow your heart rate, lower your blood pressure, and relax your muscles. If you try to force sleep while your mind is still in fight or flight mode, the body will refuse to settle, keeping you tense and awake. By consciously taking slow, deep, diaphragmatic breaths, you are literally speaking the language of safety directly to your nervous system. Put your hand on your heart, feel its steady, reliable rhythm slowing down, and trust that your body knows exactly how to carry you gently into the quiet sanctuary of the night. Think of waking up from a deep, heavy sleep and feeling completely disoriented, as though your mind is still half submerged in a dream while your body tries to move. This is called sleep inertia, the temporary period of groggy cognitive impairment that occurs immediately after waking. When we sleep deeply, our brainwaves slow down to a crawl, and waking up too quickly leaves these slow wave patterns lingering across the prefrontal cortex for up to 30 minutes. During this transition, your brain is literally running two entirely different programs at the same time, trying to pull itself out of the deep water of sleep while dealing with the demands of the waking world. Think of how frustrating it can be when you need to be sharp immediately, only to find your thoughts are moving like molasses. By understanding that this grogginess is simply your brain's gentle, slow-running engine warming up, you can allow yourself a few quiet minutes to adjust without judgment. There is a natural bridge between these two worlds, and your mind needs time to cross it. Think of how you explain your own life story to yourself, the triumphs, the losses, the turning points, and how those memories form the very foundation of who you believe you are. This is called narrative identity, the internalized, evolving story a person constructs to make sense of their life. Psychologists have found that we don't merely store memories like raw data on a hard drive. We actively edit and weave them into a coherent narrative that gives us a sense of purpose and continuity over time. The way we frame our struggles, whether we see them as meaningless tragedies or opportunities for growth, can profoundly influence our mental health and resilience. Think of a difficult chapter from your past that once felt entirely painful, and how, years later, you've woven it into a story of survival and quiet wisdom. Your past is not a static monument carved in stone. It is a living story that you have the power to tell, rewrite, and understand from a place of compassion and rest. Imagine being so deeply absorbed in a gripping book, a complex project, or even a beautiful piece of music that you completely fail to notice someone gently calling your name or touching your arm. This is known as inattentional numbness, a phenomenon where intense mental focus can temporarily block out actual physical sensations. Because the brain's processing capacity is strictly limited, when we allocate almost all of our cognitive energy to a single demanding task, the sensory regions simply run out of resources to register other incoming data. It shows that our experience of the physical world is entirely dependent on where we choose to place the spotlight of our attention. Think of how easily we can become overwhelmed by the constant noise and sensory overload of modern life, and the relief of knowing you can choose to narrow your focus. By turning your attention completely to one simple, quiet thing, like the gentle rise and fall of your chest, you can quietly mute the rest of the world. Deep within your brain's parietal lobe lies a highly detailed sensory map of your entire body, where every finger, every toe, and every patch of skin has its own dedicated patch of neural real estate. This map, sometimes illustrated as the homunculus, is constantly active, processing every tiny touch, temperature change, and physical sensation in real time. Interestingly, this neural map is highly plastic, meaning it can expand or shrink based on how often we use a particular body part, or quiet down entirely when we enter deep relaxation. During meditation or progressive muscle relaxation, consciously directing your attention to different parts of this map can help release physical tension you didn't even know you were holding. Think of taking a slow, mental journey down your own body right now, letting your shoulders soften, your hands grow heavy, and your feet release their grip on the day. By sending safety signals to this internal map, you are telling your brain that the physical journey of the day is finally over. Think of how some people naturally come alive in the quiet hours of the night, finding their focus and creativity when the rest of the world has gone to sleep, while others find their energy peaking with the very first light of dawn. These patterns are not merely habits or signs of discipline. They are driven by genetic chronotypes that dictate our individual circadian rhythms. Your internal master clock, controlled by a tiny cluster of cells in the brain called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, regulates when hormones like melatonin and cortisol are released. Trying to force yourself into a sleep schedule that contradicts your natural chronotype can lead to chronic fatigue and a persistent feeling of being out of step with the world. Think of the quiet relief in letting go of the expectation that everyone must live on the exact same schedule. Whether you are a morning bird or a night owl, your rhythm is a natural, beautiful part of your biology. And tonight, you are exactly where you belong. Think of the comfort of listening to a familiar podcast host, reading a favorite author, or hearing a gentle voice guide you through the dark, and feeling a genuine sense of companionship even though you've never met. This is called a parasocial connection, a one-sided psychological bond we form with media figures, characters, or voices. While once dismissed as a poor substitute for real-world interaction, psychologists now recognize that these connections draw on the very same neural systems involved in real friendship and social safety. Our brains are deeply cooperative and social, meaning they can find real, measurable comfort in the tone of a kind voice or the shared thoughts of another mind, regardless of distance. Think of how quiet and empty a room can feel at night, and how quickly that feeling can soften when you bring a warm, steady presence into your space. In the silent architecture of the night, you are allowed to borrow comfort from wherever it is offered, finding safety in shared human thought. Imagine sitting next to someone you care about in complete, comfortable silence, and noticing how, after a few minutes, a sense of deep, effortless peace seems to settle over both of you at the exact same time. This is driven by autonomic synchrony, the remarkable tendency for people in close physical proximity to unconsciously coordinate their heart rates, breathing patterns, and even skin conductance. When we feel safe with someone, our nervous systems begin to communicate without language, mirroring each other's physiological states to create a shared sanctuary of calm. This synchrony is one of our oldest evolutionary bonding mechanisms, allowing families and small groups to co-regulate and soothe each other's stress simply by being near. Think of how deeply comforting it is to rest your head near someone you love, listening to the steady, rhythmic beat of their heart. Even in the dark, our bodies remain in constant, quiet conversation, reminding us that we are built to find rest, safety, and home in the presence of one another. Think of the quiet satisfaction of learning a collection of random, fascinating facts about the world right before sleep, and how that gentle mental exploration can make your own daily worries feel suddenly smaller and easier to carry. This is driven by epistemic curiosity, our natural intrinsic desire to acquire new knowledge for the sheer pleasure of understanding. When we engage in low-stakes learning, the brain releases small, steady amounts of dopamine, activating our reward pathways without triggering the stress or urgency associated with goal-oriented tasks. This gentle stimulation keeps the mind just engaged enough to prevent it from looping back to personal worries, acting like a soft anchor for wandering thoughts. Think of how beautiful it is that your mind can find peace simply by turning its gaze outward to the mysteries of science, history, and human nature. By giving your brain interesting, neutral things to hold on to, you are allowing the urgent, loud demands of the day to quietly dissolve into the background. Picture an astronaut looking down at the Earth from the absolute silence of space, seeing our entire blue planet hanging like a fragile glass marble against the vast, empty dark of the universe. This experience often triggers a profound cognitive shift known as the overview effect, an overwhelming feeling of awe, unity, and an intense realization of how small and interconnected all of our lives truly are. From that distance, the borders we draw, the conflicts we wage, and the individual worries we carry every day suddenly seem remarkably tiny and insignificant. Psychologists study this effect to understand how experiencing deep awe can quiet the brain's self-referential networks, instantly reducing stress and fostering a deep sense of compassion for others. Think of looking up at a starry night sky and feeling a similar wave of perspective settle into your chest. In the grand scale of the universe, the things that felt heavy at noon are allowed to be small, and you are allowed to simply rest in the quiet. Think of that final, beautiful threshold where waking thoughts begin to dissolve, turning into strange, floating images, half-formed melodies, and the gentle, weightless sensation of drifting away. This is the hypnagogic state, the transitional phase of consciousness between being awake and falling asleep. During this brief magical window, your brain is transitioning from rapid alpha waves to the slow, steady theta waves of deep rest, allowing your logical mind to quietly step down from its watch. In this space, the usual boundaries of reality soften, opening a door to rich, dreamlike associations, where the impossible suddenly feels completely natural. Think of the absolute safety of this moment, knowing you no longer have to steer the ship, solve any problems, or hold any tension in your body. You have reached the very edge of the map, and the currents of sleep are ready to carry you the rest of the way. Let go of the shore, let your breath go deep and slow, and allow yourself to drift. 100 facts, 100 quiet reminders of how beautiful, complex, and resilient your mind truly is. Your brain has spent the entire day protecting you, organizing your world, and carrying you through every challenge, and now it has earned the right to go quiet. The questions of the day have been asked, the thoughts have been processed, and the long road of today has brought you safely here, to this moment of absolute stillness. You don't have to carry anything else tonight. Whatever is waiting for you tomorrow can wait a little longer. smaller, gentler, and easier to hold in the morning light. Let your shoulders sink a fraction deeper into the mattress. Let your hands rest, heavy and warm, by your side. Let the room go completely quiet and let the darkness wrap you in its patient, peaceful safety. This is Midnight Station. The journey is complete. The mind is understood, and the night is yours. Sleep well. And tonight, we rest.